Welcome to The Blitz, a podcast from Coram Deo Church. The Blitz is all about tackling tough topics head-on at full speed. Are you ready? Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of the day it is that you happen to be listening to this episode of The Blitz. My name is John Needham. I am the lead pastor of Coram Deo Church, and today, once again, maybe someday we'll have someone new, but today, once again, I am your host on The Blitz. In this episode, I will be looking at offering a critical review of Tisby's, that's Jemar Tisby's latest book, How to Fight Racism. Some of you may remember that before this podcast was even launched, I promised on Facebook that I was going to read the book and offer a review of the book. And so here we are, episode 8, 9, 10, 11. I don't know where we're at in this mess, but here we are. Today is the review of that book. So, a couple things to know. This is the first book that I did not read, but I listened to, or I should say I listened to most of it. I got a couple chapters in and then decided, go ahead, get an Audible account. That was a first for me. And so got the book, listened to it, and here we are. Here's my critique of how to fight racism. A couple things I want to say first before we dive into the critique, and that is the things that I agree with Tisby on, things that I think that are helpful as we think about the issue of racism, both personally and culturally. First of all, is that all people, regardless of gender or race or socioeconomic class, all people are made in the image of the triune God. We are not accidents. The story of human history is not one of the favored advancing, the strong eating the weak. Evolution is not our story. Creation is our story. The triune God made Adam and Eve in his image. All human beings bear that image. All human beings are made in the image of God. God knits together every individual in their mother's womb. Everybody has value, dignity, and worth. It is an intrinsic reality as a consequence of us being made in the image of God. We cannot talk about human rights without grounding our anthropology in creation. God made us. God created us in his image, and therefore there is a unique value that all people possess, regardless of whatever else may be true of them. So Tisby goes there. I think it's really important to acknowledge that and to make sure that all of our discussions about human value and worth and interactions, that they have to start there, because if they don't start there, then we're really just talking about preference, okay? Then secondly, obviously, by the title of the book, and anybody who knows Tisby, Tisby is acknowledging the reality of racism that existed both in the history of our country, the history of the world, and so that is an issue, and Christians need to speak up about it. Christians need to repent of any and all racist attitudes that may exist in their hearts or in their minds. They need to repent of all racist actions that have been taken, that they have participated in, and wherever racism is seen, culturally as a society, we do as the church, we have a prophetic voice, and we need to be calling that out wherever it is and as we see it. So those are things that can be affirmed. Those are things that can be celebrated. Those things are things that I can say, hey, I read this, and I say amen to that. However, very early on in Tisby's book, it becomes very apparent. Tisby just goes there, right? So I'm not reading into things. This is what he says. Tisby is not interested in talking about personal racism, meaning the racism that would exist in an individual's mind or heart. What he wants to go after is systemic racism. And this is not just what Tisby wants to talk about. This is what all of kind of the new culture warriors, the social justice warriors, the Black Lives Matter, the people who buy into that ideology, who are part of that, what they want to talk about is systemic racism. The issue is not the individual. The issue is not a person's character, their choices, the decisions they make, how they live their life. The issue is the system, right? It's about the system. And what this does is it creates categories. It creates incredibly far-reaching and I think unhelpful categories, okay? Because it is about the system and it's not about an individual, there is one or two categories that you're going to fit into in Tisby's world. So if you're a white person, and this book is predominantly written to white people, okay? If you're white and you don't see systemic racism the way that he sees systemic racism, then you are part of the problem, right? So if you don't see this issue the way that he sees it, it's because you're part of the problem. In fact, on page 4 of his book, he says he defines racism not as something that exists in the heart of an individual that is expressed to another person, but rather it is a system of oppression that is based on race. Now, again, notice there's nothing about the individual. It is all about the system. And that's what sets Tisby and others like him up to be able to make statements like this. This is something Tisby says in his book. Everyone is either fighting racism or supporting it, right? So it doesn't matter whether or not you love your black neighbor, you see them as an equal, you care for them. That doesn't matter. You're either bought into his worldview and you're fighting racism, and if you're not fighting racism and you are suspicious of terms such as systemic racism, then you are actually supporting it, right? And this is just how Tisby sees the world. If you are white, you are a racist, or you are directly benefiting from a system that is racist, and so you bear responsibility for racism whether or not you participate in it. Whether racism actually exists in your heart, if you're white, you're part of the problem, okay? And what this does is you read the book, you realize that there are really only two kinds of white people in Tisby's world. The first is this: you agree with what Tisby says, and you say, yes, I'm white, I'm a racist, okay? That's one option. The other option is that you disagree with Tisby, but by disagreeing with him, you're only proving your white fragility, and you are proving the fact that you are, in fact, a racist and that you support systemic racism. And so the options are A, you're a racist, or B, you're a racist. Right? So those are the options for the reader of the book. I really think that is not helpful in terms of trying to pursue reconciliation. We'll talk about reconciliation later. But you just need to realize that that's kind of how Tisby sets it up. And so Tisby is going to talk a lot, almost exclusively about systemic racism. That's what he's interested in. But this also begs a question. This is a question that's doesn't only need to be asked of Tisby, it needs to be asked of everybody who talks about systemic racism, and that is, please define it and substantiate it, right? What specifically, give me examples, show me, right, systemic racism. Okay. Now remember, it is a system of oppression that is based on race. That's how he defines racism. And throughout the book, Tisby does try to offer examples to substantiate the claim of widespread systemic racism. Now, he offers examples. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. These are not the only 2 that he gives, but there are 2 that I want to just talk about briefly because they will demonstrate some of the issues with the the claim of systemic racism. So one of the examples happens on page 85 of his book. Tisby is talking about a conversation that took place between a white family and a black family. The black family had a child that had just recently got their license, and so they had to have a conversation with their, I don't remember if it was a son or a daughter. They had to have a conversation with their child as a black person, what they need to do in the car in the case that they get pulled over by a cop. And of course, the assumption is they get pulled over by a white cop. Okay. And so the black couple in the book basically shares some things with the white couple. This is the conversation they had to have with their child. Okay. And I'm quoting this. This is word for word. Turn on the dome light in the car if it is dark. Don't make any sudden moves. Keep your hands visible at all times. Stay calm no matter what the officer does. So that is the advice that the black family gave to their child. And the white family is listening to this and apparently is cut to the heart and is wondering, why would anybody have to have a conversation with their child about what to do if they got pulled over by a cop? And Tisby uses this as an example of the radically different experience, of a white person getting pulled over and a black person getting pulled over. Now, I read that example, okay, and maybe you can just chalk this up to this is a bad example and Tisby should have been more responsible as an author, but it is an example that he gives, okay? So I read that and I thought, gosh, turn the dome light on in the car, don't make any sudden moves, keep your hands visible at all times, stay calm. That doesn't sound like something that would, just be told to a black driver because of systemic racism. That seems like the kind of conversation any parent should be having with any, child who's getting a license. And I thought, is it just me? Am I imagining this? So what I did, and what you can do right now, if you don't believe me, you can Google, what should I do if I get pulled over by a cop? So I did that. I Googled it. And I found numerous websites. There are state websites that have this information. There are national organizations that have this information, but they tell you what to do if you get pulled over by a cop. And almost verbatim, what all the websites suggested was turn on the dome light if it's dark. That way the cop can see you. Don't make any sudden moves. Keep your hands visible at all times and stay calm. And I thought, wow, that is common sense. That's not something that you have to do because cops are racist. That's something that you have to do because cops put themselves in dangerous situations all the time. They have no idea what they are getting into when they walk up to a car that is pulled over, and they have to be prepared for the worst. And so any human being that gets pulled over by a cop should do those things. If it's dark, turn on the dome light, keep your hands on the wheel, move slowly, right? And just be respectful. That's not something that we need to do because of systemic racism. That is something that all people should do just out of common sense, okay? The other example I want to bring up is an example. I don't remember what chapter it's in. I tried to thumb through and find it again, but I remember I listened to most of this book, so I didn't have a visual on where it was at on the page. But he talks about an instance where there was I think it was a black gal wanted to go to a university, but the tuition was too high and she couldn't afford it. And Tisby says that it's not rare that the tuition is higher than a black family can afford. And so what the way he assesses that situation is that the admission policies of the university were racist because the price of tuition was high. And I thought, there's a number of other ways to interpret that problem, that challenge. Why does he automatically go to systemic racism? You get the sense that Tisby sees systemic racism everywhere. Now, you might be tempted to say, well, that's because it is everywhere. Okay, so fair enough. But is it everywhere? What is going on? Why does Tisby see systemic racism everywhere? Well, there's a cliche saying When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Why does everything look like systemic racism to Tisby? Okay. Whenever in Tisby's world, whenever there is a discrepancy in a statistical outcome between black people and white people, right? Anytime there is a statistical discrepancy, Tisby sees that, and that is always an example of systemic racism. That proves the point. The system is racist, and because there are statistical discrepancies in outcomes between white people and black people, that proves that the system is racist. So what does that mean? I mean, that sounds super confusing. Let me just put it to you this way. There about 76% of the population in the United States is white, and about 13% is black, okay? So in Tisby's world, we should have, if you had 100 doctors, right, 76% of those could be white, and at least 13% of them should be black. That would be a representative outcome between the demographics of the population and the number of people who are employed in the field of medicine. So if you had 100 doctors, okay, for example, and 85% of them, or somewhere around there, of them were white, and 5% of the doctors were black, Tisby would see that statistical discrepancy. Black people make up 13% of the population. Only 5% of doctors are black. And I'm just making those numbers up. This is just an example. For Tisby, that would be an example, a hard example of systemic racism, because the system is producing numbers that are not in line with population percentages and whatever. Okay, so that is an example of systemic racism. However, it's very interesting for Tisby that it does not work the other way, right? It does not work the other way. So let me give you an example of it. About 76% of the population is white, about 13% of the population is black. Now, one would expect organizations that are deeply committed to the issue of racial and social justice and all of that to represent those numbers proportionately, right? Well, you just need to know that when massive organizations and corporations say they're all about social justice, the one thing that you can be sure about is that they are not at all about social justice. They just want to be seen as an organization that is about social justice, right? So let's consider the NFL for a moment. The NFL is primarily made up of black players, right? About 75% of the players on NFL rosters are occupied. Those positions are occupied by black people, and white people make up about 25%. You can find those statistics online just about anywhere. Okay. Now, I want to be very, very clear. I have no problem with those numbers. I do not care that black people make up 13% of the population and occupy 75% of the roster positions on an NFL team. You know why? Because sports is a meritocracy, right? You don't make the team because of the color of your skin. You make the team because of the skill that you possess, right? And an organization that prioritizes the skill of its players is going to produce a better product, right? So I don't care I don't care about that discrepancy, right? But neither does Tisby, and that's what's interesting, because if the numbers were flipped, if it was 75% of the players were white and 25% of the players were black, right, he might have a problem with that. But he doesn't have a problem when it's flipped. And by the way, professional sports, those statistics seem to, pretty much go across the board, right? So I want to offer this, okay? He doesn't care when it's flipped. The issue is statistical outcomes, and wherever there is a discrepancy, it is always assumed that it is systemic racism. However, as I was considering, the argument that Tisby's trying to make, and others like him try to make, it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination or thought to to realize or to understand that there are a number of factors that play into a particular outcome, right? There's a number of things that play into a particular outcome. And assuming that racism is always the primary factor, it's always the driving factor in the statistics and any sort of discrepancy in those statistics, to assume that racism is always the primary factor, right, is not exactly responsible, and it may not be intellectually dishonest. Okay, let me give you an example that somebody who's looking for systemic racism might see and go, aha, there it is. But upon a little bit of further investigation, you would realize that it actually has nothing to do with systemic racism, and it can be explained entirely in a different way. So here it is. I'm just making this up. Okay, this is a hypothetical situation. Let's say that you have two guys who are selling lemonade outside of a Costco. Now, I don't know that they sell lemonade outside of Costco. Back in the day, you used to be able to get a soda and I think it was a hot dog or a pretzel for like $1.50, and now it's on the inside. So I just kind of dated myself there. But let's just, for the sake of argument, you got two guys selling lemonade outside of Costco. You got it? All right. These guys are selling lemonade outside of a Costco in the same city. They're actually selling this lemonade outside of the same Costco. They're selling the exact same lemonade, packaged the same way, in the same cup. They are selling the exact same proportion size. And they are selling this lemonade in the exact same location. So all things are equal here, okay? The Costco is the same. It's in the same city. It's the same lemonade. It's the same cup. It's the same serving size. And it is at the same location outside of the store. And let's go on top of it and saying it's the same price. Okay, so all things at this point are equal. Now, one guy is selling on a Monday and the other guy is selling on let's just say, a Thursday. Now, for the sake of argument, let's say that the guy selling on a Monday, he sells 300 units of his lemonade, and the guy selling on a Thursday sells 65 units of his lemonade. And let's just, for the sake of argument, say that the guy who sold 300 units on Monday is a white guy, and the guy who sold 65 units on Thursday was a black guy. Okay, now, Tisby is going to see this, right? Because all other things are equal. He's going to see this as a clear example of systemic racism, okay? However, a little, thoughtful questions, a little investigating would reveal an entirely different reality. For example, what if on Sunday or on Monday, it was sunny and hot outside, and on Thursday, it was cold and rainy? What if Monday was payday? If you've ever been to Costco on payday, you know it is way more full than it is on other days. So what if Monday was payday and 4 times as many people went to Costco that day as they went on Thursday? All of those factors would easily explain the discrepancy in the outcome, and none of those factors would have anything to do with racism whatsoever. As a side note, in a future episode here on the Blitz, I'm going to talk about Black Lives Matters and what I think is contributing to much of the problems that people of color are experiencing in our country. I do think there are other explanations, but that's just a teaser for a future episode. Right now, I want to ask, why does Tisby see racism everywhere? Okay. And so you need to realize nobody sees the world in an entirely objective way. We all think that we're seeing the world objectively, but the reality is that all of us see the world through a lens that is called a worldview lens. And that lens, right, when you're wearing glasses, you don't see the glasses, you see through the glasses. Well, a worldview is the same way. You don't look at a worldview, you look at the world through a worldview. And that worldview is made up of things like values and beliefs and commitments and what people call plausibility structures. Everybody sees a situation through a lens. That's why two people can look at the same situation, guys selling lemonade outside of a Costco, and come to very different conclusions and explanations as to why there is a discrepancy in the outcome. So what lens does Jemar Tisby see the world through? Well, as you read the book, Tisby never comes out and says it, but it becomes very clear. And in fact, this is why he was, I believe, dismissed from the seminary. He sees the world through the lens of what is called critical race theory, which is a variant of Marxism. Now, if you want to get into the weeds on critical race theory, intersectionality, and Marxism, go to Corumdale Church's website. There's a resources section, and you can select the According to the Word lectures, and you'll see that there's a lecture on the gospel and race and critical race theory. It is a 2-hour lecture. It is incredibly helpful at getting into the weeds, the specifics of all of these issues. I'm not going to get into all of the weeds here, but I'll just give you kind of a cursory 30,000 feet. This is how Marxism, critical race theory works, okay? Marx and Marxism essentially divided the world into two categories. There were the oppressors and there were the oppressed, okay? And that distinction, oppressor and oppressed, what made you fit into one of those two categories, remember there's only two categories, that should sound familiar, what those categories were defined by was an economic status. It was how much money you had. So if you had money, you were the oppressor, and if you didn't have money, you were the oppressed, okay? Critical race theory is a very similar worldview, but instead of seeing through a lens that puts people in groups based on the resources that they have, critical race theory divides the world into two groups, but those two groups are determined by the color of your skin. It's not about economics. It's not about character. It's not about choices, personal choices that you make. It is all about the color of your skin. So the oppressor class consists of people who are white. This is why Tisby can say you're either fighting against it or you are fighting for racism. If you are a white person, you belong to the oppressor class, not because you're a racist, not because of your character, not because of anything that you do, but simply because of the color of your skin. And on the flip side, if you are a person of color, if you are black, then you belong to the oppressed category, and that has nothing to do with your actual life experience. It has nothing to do with your socioeconomic status, whatever class that you fall into. It has everything to do with the color of your skin. So, for example, if you're LeBron James and you're an incredibly successful athlete and businessman, as he has done incredibly well for himself. He belongs to the oppressed class. Not because he's poor, not because of anything specifically he has experienced, but simply because of the color of his skin. And at the same time, if you are a poor white person living in a trailer somewhere, you are part of the oppressor class, not because you have money, not because you're oppressing anybody, but simply because you're white. For critical race theory, the determining factor is the color of your skin, not the content of your character. Now, that sounds racist, doesn't it? It just sounds racist. And that is part of the problem, okay? Now, here's something. I want to mention this because it happens on the first page of Tisby's book, and it needs to be called out. It needs to be identified. On the very first page, you'll start reading chapter 1, page 1. Tisby refers to black people, and he uses a capital B to refer to black people, and then he refers to white people, a sentence or two later, and it's a lowercase w. And as a reader, you notice that and you go, hey, why is he doing that? And there's a little footnote at the bottom of the page, and he explains it, and he says that naming is a political act, a demonstration of power. It is an exertion of power, okay? So whenever he refers to black people throughout his book, it's a capital B. Whenever he refers to white people throughout the book, it is a lowercase w, Okay. Now I want to ask you something. If you read a book by a white pastor and on the first page, he told you every time I refer to white people, I'm going to use a capital W. And every time I refer to black people, I'm going to use a lowercase, every time I refer to white people, it's a capital W. Every time I refer to black people, it's a lowercase b. And I'm doing this to exert power. Okay. What would you think? How would that statement land, right? I'm guessing that you would have the sense that this is actually racism, right? When you are not treating people equally, right? And you're treating them based on the color of their skin. Is that not the very racism that Tisby is claiming to fight against? Isn't that racism? And it's hard to shake that when you read the book. How is it that is an acceptable thing to do? And if that is a racist thing to do, how is it that you fight racism with racism? That's a real question. It's a real issue, and I think it is an issue with Tisby's book and with his worldview. Now, there's one last thing. Actually, two things I want to say here as we end the episode. First of all, as you read Tisby's book, you will get the impression that all black people think and feel the same way that Tisby does. Okay, Tisby never allows room for the position that a black person would actually disagree with his definition and diagnosis of systemic racism. Tisby speaks as if he is speaking for all black people. However, right, that's not true. He's not actually speaking for all black people. Now, it is true that the vast majority of black authors and speakers right now who are talking about this issue, the platform is primarily occupied by people who agree with Tisby. However, you'll find that there are black authors, there are black pastors and theologians who absolutely disagree. There are numerous black people who disagree with Tisby's assessment and diagnosis of what is going on. They do not get the platform, and they do not get the attention that Tisby gets, but they absolutely disagree with him. And I think that's an important note to make, because nothing that Tisby says would ever lead you to suspect that any black person living in our country disagrees with him. But you need to know they do. If you're interested in reading a source, Vadi Bakum, Fault Lines is the latest book that he came out. He has been talking about issues of social justice and critical race theory, not for a couple of years, but for a couple of decades. He is an incredibly bright, brilliant man, committed to the scriptures, loves the church, and he would just have a heyday with Tisby's worldview. But I just want to point out, Tisby acts as everybody of color agrees with him. That's just not true. Okay, this last thing. This is a sense that I got in reading the book, and I didn't like that I was feeling it, and I was trying to be self-critical of the sense, but I could never shake the sense that I was getting, and it was this. I got the impression reading the book that it didn't matter what I said or what I did. It didn't matter what the white church, whatever that means, said or did. It would never be enough for Tisby. It just felt like it didn't matter what you did. It was never going to be enough to actually reconcile the relationship. I would explain it like this: if you were convicted that you had done something wrong, and you sought to make that right, and so you reached out to the person that you had harmed, and you said, "Man, God has convicted me of this. This is wrong. I want to make it right. I want to repent of my sin, and I want to restore the relationship, and I want to be reconciled to you." And that person always had another thing that you needed to do, right? And so you came to them with a broken heart, and they kind of held you at arm's length, and they said, "Well, you need to do these things." And let's say that you committed to doing those things, and then you came back. Now you need to do these things. and you committed to doing those things, and you came back to them and said, now you need to do these things, you would just, sooner or later, you would get the impression that I'm not sure this person actually wants to be reconciled with me. It feels like this person wants to use this issue to have power. Okay, that's the impression that you would feel. Now, that is the impression that I got in reading the book. I don't know that there's enough that I could ever do to satisfy Tisby. And it made me feel, right, that this book about racial reconciliation, that was actually that was always going to be out of reach. And it just seemed like Tisby doesn't really want reconciliation. He wants something, but I'm not sure I would call it reconciliation. So that sense haunted me. And I'm like, do I really want to talk about that in the podcast? Because it's just the sense that I got. I can't quite, put my finger on it, but it was really bugging me. And then it happened. Then I heard the podcast where Tisby talks about leaving the church and leaving loud and encouraging other people to leave their churches. And I thought, man, it's really hard to take a guy seriously who's talking about reconciliation when he just leaves the church. He leaves his brothers and sisters. He's not fighting for reconciliation, but he's just, hey guys, I'm out. And he's encouraging others to do the same thing. That leads me to think, whatever Tisby is actually after in this book, I'm not totally convinced it's reconciliation. So those are my thoughts on the book. Love it, hate it, I don't know. That was my read on it. And if you're really interested, you want to look for yourself, I guess go ahead and read the book. But I would certainly recommend, if you're going to read the book, read it alongside another voice. Read along with Vadi Bakkum's Fault Lines, in which he gets into the issues of racial justice and all of that. All right, thanks for hanging out with me. I think this was a long episode today. A lot to say, a lot to go over. Thanks for being part of this episode of The Blitz. Like I said, there's going to be another episode coming later that's going to be dealing with Black Lives Matter and what is really hurting the Black community in our country, what I believe is really the problem. But anyways, that's coming in the future. Until then, take care, and we will see you next time on The Blitz.